how do you develop the ability to sort of like go from likely, possible, or probable and into preposterous? Like, so, like, how do you learn to think about the future in that way? Because I mean, we're so the education system is almost opposite of that, right? It's like here's a very narrow band. You can project forward a day or two, and the cone of the future that you see, even though it might be really wide at the end, what you see is almost like a beam of light.
Right. And this is why it's so important to get into the right headspace, right? Like knowing that the future can be defined by determined people and understanding that there's a process for considering alternative futures other than looking forward for the present is the key. And so you get out of the present by talking to these seers and riffing on the different types of potential futures. And so, and then, maybe it's good to come up with some examples of the different types. So, if I think of plausible futures, a great example is an entrepreneur that I was lucky to work with, still working with Todd McKinnon and Freddie Karras at Okta. And so Todd had been head of engineering at Salesforce, and he sees that Salesforce is blowing up and that customers are having these problems using the cloud. They're early adopters of the cloud. So when I met Todd, he says, I think the cloud is going to be a thing. I think there's going to be a lot of big cloud companies. And I think that cloud customers are going to have problems reconciling all their cloud apps. And I know a lot of these customers, and I have a good line of sight on what their problems will be because I'm solving technical problems for them today. So when you hear that, it's kind of like, I can't unsee that now, right? That sounds totally plausible to me that he's right. And it sounds totally plausible to me that if anybody could figure this out, he could. And if anybody had an authentic set of ideas for how it would get solved, it would be him. And so to me, that's why it's a plausible insight. Once you hear it, you're like, oh, yeah, of course. He's right. If he executes, it feels quite plausible that he'll win, that he'll have a company that's interesting.
And how do we think, like, how do we map this as you're talking? I'm thinking like Steve Jobs and his reputation as having this reality distortion field and like creating the future and like almost pulling people into the future versus saying like, this is the future and I'm going to convince you. It's more like, no, I'm going to reach back into the past and pull you to this. Or Elon Musk and Mars would be like another example, right?
Yeah. So and we'll get to Elon. Elon would be a preposterous future, right? Like
But he
Elon
creates
says,
it.
yeah, he's like, I'm going to build a car company when one hasn't succeeded in 50 years. And I'm going to charge lots of money and it's going to be electric. Or I'm going to create rockets and blast them into outer space when NASA hasn't even been doing that lately. And so it's like, so most people, when they hear that, they'd be like, Elon, that just sounds preposterous, right? Like I don't believe you. But how does Tesla happen? How does SpaceX happen? When Elon's talking about first principles thinking, on some level, he's describing inflections that he pulls together into a preposterous product. A Tesla has advances in battery technology, advances in sensor technology, AI, machine learning, network effects. All of those things come together into a product that would have seemed preposterous, but can actually happen if you project out into the future where these inflections will converge someday. And so, he's one of my favorite examples. Steve Jobs, you brought him up in the reality distortion field. I think that's a really insightful question because it gets at something subtle that I think is important. You have practitioners or people who live in the present, and you have seers or people who live in the future. But what an entrepreneur is when they're doing their job well, on some level, they're a time traveler. And so why is that? They go out into the future. They develop a perspective on futures that are more likely than people in the present realize based on the inflections. But now they've got more work to do. They have to come back to the present and they have to start a movement, and they have to convince early followers of that movement to come to this new future with them. And as the movement accelerates, what was once a non-consensus and non-conventional heretical insight becomes the accepted conventional wisdom. And now it's no longer a startup, it's a company. And now it's no longer just a movement, it's a market. And so this is part of why you need to have a reality distortion field when you're an entrepreneur. Like nobody rational would buy a product from a startup that's probably going to go out of business. No rational employee would join a startup, crazy team when it's probably going to go out of business. So there has to be something that's animating that decision that's more than just a rational if then what else statement. It's got to be, you know what, I can't unsee that future now. I want to make that future happen too. I'll feel worse for not being part of making that new future happen than I will if we try and we fail.